Hello and welcome to the first episode of the HelloHistoria podcast. You may have found this podcast via the work of Louvain Rees. Over the last 10 years, Louvain has become an award-winning and nationally recognised social historian of death and psychiatry in Wales. Named as one of the winners of the BBC History 30 Under 30 competition, she's a social media sensation. Hello Louvain.
Hello.
My name is Dr. John Kirkup. I'm a senior lecturer at Cardiff University, and Louvain and I thought it might be nice to start a podcast series where we could chat about her research into asylums, workhouses, and whatever takes our fancy. Mostly we'll be delving into the lives of working class folk as they turn up in the archives. It's not intended to be a deep academic analysis, more a light-hearted chat about everyday people making their way in Victorian Britain. In this first episode, we thought we would chat about lunatic asylums in Wales. So Louvain, where would you like to start?
My area of research focuses on lunatic asylums in Wales, but more specifically lunatic asylums in South Wales from the early 19th century up until about 1921, so it's really specific.
So when was the first lunatic asylum established in Wales?
Private or public?
I don't know, what's the difference?
One's privately funded and one's publicly funded, so
the first ones, I guess, were privately funded.
Yeah.
So when was that?
The first private asylum to be opened in Wales was opened in 1815 by Dr. Thomas Hobbes. He was the first known Welsh psychiatrist, and it was situated in Mayhill House in Swansea, where the estate is now.
So why did they start then? Was that, where were people going before they had, people obviously had mental illnesses or, people needed to support and help, but where did they go before then?
Here, there and everywhere, really. Wherever there was space. A lot of people went to Bedlam in London. Other people went to other, mostly private places.
So Wales was a little bit behind where there were places in cities in England that people from Wales went to.
Yeah, there was lots of places before actual public asylums.
But they were quite small, I guess, were they? Were just basically just one or two people running them almost as like private homes rather than... Because when we see an asylum, when we think of asylums today, they're really large institutions, huge. But in the early part of the 19th century...
The first asylums which were private were basically they call it a trade in lunacy, that people would buy houses, convert them into private lunatic asylums or madhouses, and then charge local government for them to send their insane inhabitants there. And it was sort of money making.
So they were profit making. They were making
they
a
were
profit.
Making profit, and that way they would get the money, and then the people that were sent there were sort of left to their own.
So normally it was the local authorities in the early 19th century. That's like through the poor law, I guess, is it, that it's being funded?
Yeah.
So is that the problem? So one of the reasons why
they're not regular, private houses weren't regulated.
Yeah. Until much later, where the regulation starts coming in the middle part of the 19th century.
Yeah.
So part of the reason why they were founded, or the ones in Wales were founded in the early 19th century, is that sort of industrialisation, that suddenly there's lots more people that need to be dealt with by the poor laws. The people paying for that, I guess the poor laws paid by the local...
ratepayers.
By the ratepayers, yeah. So they're quite affluent people. You're paying rates in the early 19th century are quite rich, aren't you? So they kind of... Is that what it was? They sort of realised they were paying a lot of money, sort of privately run institutions.
I think it was mostly cost, because as with any government, that's what priority usually is.
Yeah, because I guess what's happening is that the poor law, they're coming together, they're looking at the costs in each quarter or each year and how much they're paying for something, and then thinking we better do something about this.
Yeah, but they already had, after Mayhill closed, because Thomas Hobbes died and sort of nobody else wanted it, someone called Robert Valentine Leach bought Britain Ferry House, and he turned that into a private asylum, which was basically a money-making building, really. It was all for profit, what he did. But that served as an interim place for people to go. So
Britain Ferry is at Port Talbot now?
Yeah, it's behind... Again, it's actually a housing estate now. It's behind St Mary's Church in Britain Ferry. And it was a really nice mansion house, and he turned it into a hospital.
So it must have got, it was taking in patients, well, they were called patients at that time, from all over South Wales, were they, at that point, or from...
Yeah, whoever wanted to go there and who wanted to pay, really, because...
So were there private patients as well as public patients through that period?
Yeah.
So you've done a fair bit of research into Vernon House, so should we chat about that?
Okay then. Vernon House was, like I said earlier, it was founded by Robert Valentine Leach from Wiltshire. His family had a lot of money, and
So was he a medical doctor?
no, he was not a medical doctor. He just had a lot of money, and he bought Burton Ferry House and turned it into a money-making thing, really. There's not a lot of, like with the archive records, there's not actually much sort of good that people have actually said about him in like the original records when you look through them.
Where are they held?
Glamorgan Archives.
Right. So who's checking on him? Who's, they're paying for these patients to stay at Vernon House. Who's checking that he's looking after them?
They were called the visitors, and they would go in and check everything was being run properly, because of when it opened in 1843, a majority of the patients from Glamorgan were going to Vernon House, whether it was privately paid or publicly paid. So the Board of Guardians and the visitors sort of had a duty then to sort of check. But he did have a doctor there, which was his son-in-law. But it wasn't a very nice place from what I've read about.
Because it's really before the time where the local authorities are really checking on stuff efficiently and effectively. I guess,
just think, for the most part, I don't think
they didn't really care very much about the patients.
Because
So where were they coming from? If some of them were private, were the others coming from the workhouses, or?
Some were private, so you'd have like wealthy families would pay for their relatives to be there, and then other places, other people would be coming from workhouses, because I think off the top of my head it might be 1834.
Yeah.
When the unions were established, they weren't allowed to actually have lunatics in the workhouse. For a period of so many days, they were allowed there, but they had to be transferred to the nearest private.
Yeah.
Well, at that time it would have been private.
Under the rules
asylum,
of the workhouse,
yeah.
how they actually functioned, and because through this period, it's a mid 19th century period where you're seeing kind of more legislation around workhouses, and also the police is getting more legislation around like Peel as the Prime Minister. So loads of things are simultaneously happening around sort of controlling some of those institutions that previously been sort of private. So they had to move them by.
They had to move them. Some went to Balebrook in Bath, which is another private asylum.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So there's different. Some of them are actually led by professionals, and others, like if you're private, you get better accommodation and a lot of public paying. So like paupers, I know in Vernon House they were kept in the attic, and some of them were actually kept outside in a barn.
Even though visitors were coming and checking, the sort of level of the standard of care was, maybe obviously not what we'd expect today. So part of your research has looked into the living conditions of people who lived in places like Vernon House, hasn't it? So what have you discovered?
That a lot of people weren't treated brilliantly in private houses, and if they didn't have a private madhouse locally, they'd turn part of the local jail into somewhere where they could keep people who were deemed insane. So in Haverfordwest, it was part of Haverfordwest Castle. That was part of the jail, and part of that was used to hold people who were deemed insane. And in 1857, I think, the Lunacy Commission visited it, and the state of it was so awful that they actually published a note about it in the paper. At the time of the report, it was on the 7th of September 1857, there were 15 men and 16 women in Haverfordwest jail, deemed insane. One woman had her arms confined with long sleeves and was in the restraint chairs in a darkened cell. This was because she was noisy and she hit another patient, and was kept in the position tied to the chair from 6 p.m. until 3 p.m. the following day. It says that her hands and her feet were cold from long restraint, and her skin on her arms had been broken by the edge of the iron sleeves. And the visitors recorded that the restraint was a bit over the top and she was in a disgraceful state. And the actual commissioners ruled from that restraint chairs couldn't be used anymore. But the general condition of the prison was foul at Haverfordwest and the same as usual.
Same as usual. Wow.
Yeah, so this shows how common this type of thing was.
Wow. So if you want to follow this, if you're listening to this or watch this on YouTube, you can see this report. So do you want to talk about the report?
It's a bit earlier, but it's in 1843. Because they didn't have an asylum in Brecon at that time, she was kept in the jail in Brecon, and then she was sent to Hereford Asylum over the border, which happened to quite a lot of people, but they wouldn't actually admit her because of the state that she'd been kept in prior to her arriving in Hereford. Mm-hmm. That she'd been kept chained in a crouching position, and her knees were forced up to her chin, and her heels and her hips had sort of come into sort of like one. Mm-hmm. And she couldn't move about at all. And when she died, they had to dissect her for her to fit in her coffin.
It's just horrific, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely horrendous.
It's just mad. These are people just like us, and it's really weird to think. But I suppose the point is that it's being reported, and that, obviously it's horrific and terrible, but the fact is that the guardians and those in authority could see the kind of dire state of things. If you're being positive light on it. For those listening, Louvain is now questioning me by looking at me in a quizzical way. But what we're trying to get to is that obviously then you move into the more established asylums, right, where there are doctors and there are sort of codes of practice later in the century. Is that right, or does that not really happen?
It does, but private, even though this didn't happen in a private house, private places like Vernon House, where people was literally sleeping in barns, they still had their licence.
They still carried on.
Vernon House was opened until, I think, 1900.
Right.
It was still open, but it became used for private patients.
Right.
But they still had their licence all that long, and they were letting people sleep in attics.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's not overplay the changes. Yeah. If we kind of move on in our timeline of where asylums come from and how they're formed in Wales, I suppose there's a couple of acts. There's quite a lot of acts going through Parliament through this kind of reforming period of the 1820s, 30s, 40s. And this is happening to do with the Poor Law and also to do with in things like police and prisons. But in relation to asylums, so the 1828 Act empowered the Justice of the Peace to erect and maintain asylums from the county rates, so we talked about before. And then the 1845 Act required them to do so. That's right, isn't it? Right. So let's just talk about that, the kind of evolution of the county asylums, and particularly what you've researched, which is the Glamorgan County Asylum, isn't it?
Well, the Justices of the Peace and local gentry had a first go at putting an asylum together, and it had a very, very, very long name. Cardiganshire, Carmarthenshire, Glamorgan, Pembrokeshire, United Counties Lunatic Asylum, and it was going to be built in Dannegraig in Swansea, but by 1856 they'd given up. But that was their first attempt.
So that was never built?
No, that was never built. Yeah. They tried for 11 years and nothing happened. So they had all the deeds and everything, because I've seen the papers, but it just didn't go anywhere.
Yeah. So we talk about today about government action, is that even though the acts are taking place in 1845, in South Wales terms, the Glamorgan Asylum becomes the Glamorgan County Lunatic Asylum. It doesn't open for almost 20 years after the act is put in force. That's right,
I
isn't it?
think they had Vernon House to fall back on. And I think they probably would have been more diligent about it if they didn't have something local they couldn't fall back on.
So the 1845 Act then, it kind of defined what lunatics were, didn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's a lunatic act, that's what it was called.
Yeah.
Although we don't like that phrase maybe today, but that's what it was called. So shall I read that out? So it's lunatic shall mean every insane person, and every person being an idiot or lunatic or of unsound or imbecilic mind. So there's a lot going on there about kind of what we mean by who's actually going into these places. And the point is they're moving from the workhouses and from private houses, aren't they, to an institution, a county asylum. So lots of your research is into the Glamorgan Asylum. So should we chat about that?
The Glamorgan Asylum was the second attempt and it worked. Yeah.
So just for those who don't know, where was the Glamorgan Asylum?
It actually still exists. It's now Glamorgan Hospital, but...
So it's in Bridgend.
Yeah, it's in Penvey.
So why was it chosen for there? Why did it?
Because it was out of the way. It was, at the time, it wasn't populated. There wasn't houses about. It was just fields and fields and fields.
And was the land donated then?
It was bought because it was originally a farm, and the farm was demolished, and they just built.
So basically, the local councils, as it was, kind of had to come together and decide on a location. And they tried Swansea and it didn't work. Yeah, the Border Guardians there. It didn't work in Swansea, so they chose somewhere else. And it so happened that it was Bridgend. So once they'd chosen Bridgend, what was the plan? What did they envisage happening? For how many people did they think?
Originally built to accommodate 350 patients, but that went out the window really quickly.
And that's men and women?
Yeah.
And they were mostly coming from the workhouse at that point? Or, yeah? But from all over South Wales?
Yeah.
So you said it went out the window really quickly, so it got... What actually happened?
There were just too many people. From the records that like the minutes, I've looked at the building minutes, they always need accommodation. So that's why it's as big as it is.
And why is that? Why do you think it goes through that middle part of the 19th century? Is it to do with urbanisation that suddenly people are coming out of the woodwork almost, like people who previously been looked after in families? Or why does it suddenly get such huge numbers? Because in this podcast we've gone from like Vernon House and now we're talking about hundreds of people. Why do you think there are so many people that have been admitted?
I think when they first built it, they thought that they could just accommodate people that were in Vernon House, people that were boarded out to other asylums across the UK, and the ones in the local workhouses, but that
they massively underestimated.
They massively underestimated the amount of patients.
I suppose, because I imagine that's part of just the sheer scale of the industrialisation that was happening in Britain at the time and urbanisation, that life is changing and people were struggling with that change. From Britain through, say, from the 1810s to the 1840s, 50s, it's only a generation or a generation and a half, and you're getting, real, in South Wales, huge amounts of industrialisation and people moving into towns and having, their lives changed enormously from what had been just like rural life, really. So I suppose it's all part of that change, isn't it? With the creation of police constabularies and prisons and the sort of social reform that's happening through the middle of the 19th century. I guess it's all like part of that same story.
I think that it's got a lot to do with like migration and people coming to Wales to work in the collieries, and because a lot of the male patients were miners by occupation, and in the later years one of the doctors complains that there's very few artisans in the asylum. So what they wanted to use patients to do work, so like do windows and things, but because people were in manual occupations such as mining, the head doctor was complaining that they had to actually pay people instead of...
Just couldn't get the quality of patient anymore.
Yeah, which I think is quite funny.
So let's just have a chat about the asylum and when it opened.
1864, and the first patients were 15 men from Vernon House Asylum, which Robert Litch really didn't like because it means that he had less money. But when they...
So was that in the records that he was appealing against that?
He was appealing against it.
Yeah.
So they came in sort of like in batches. So they brought all the men first, and then they brought the women in 1865 at the start of the year. It's just like a process to get people used to it.
Yeah.
Because, some people have spent a long time in Vernon House, and they've got to get used to a new, like anyone, they've got to get used to a new...
Yeah, you've got to transition it in, and the staff and everybody else.
The complaint they had is that Glamorgan Asylum didn't have beer when they had food. So in Vernon House, you could have alcohol if you wanted to.
Right.
And they didn't, Dr. Yellowlees didn't allow that. When I was reading the report, that is the only complaint that the patients had, and they settled in fine.
Yeah.
Quite a few did try to escape.
So what happened if they tried to escape? They were just brought back, were they? There was no punishment?
If they could be brought back.
Yeah.
But it's the early days of an asylum opening, they've got to learn.
Yeah.
Really. So they sort of had to adapt with the patients. So, because it was still sort of being built as the patients went in, so like the hearing courts were being done out, and they were putting fencing up. And if you've got that little bit of freedom and you've got an open fence,
Yeah.
I think quite a few people would go for a run.
Yeah.
But all the ones that escaped then, they got back.
Yeah.
And then they just adapted with that, really, that they sort of just built higher fences, and they got more attendants. So people's just like, every place like that has teething problems.
Was it welcome? Like, was it in the newspapers that it was happening, and were they happy that there were jobs, or was there appeal again? Did they not want an asylum in the local area?
I think because it was out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
Like most asylums, like North Wales Asylum, that's completely out of the way.
So it was just reported on in the press, really.
It was reported on, like we've got,
and I suppose that's,
and it does bring jobs.
Yeah. Well, there's loads of, that sort of 1850s, 60s, 70s, there's loads of institutions. They're still around today, the buildings still exist, and the Victorian, the high Victorian architecture is like all around us. So I think maybe over the next couple of podcasts, we can sort of expand a bit more into some of the research you've done there, into the stories of the people and the life, and as the asylum kind of grew. And you mentioned Dr. Yellowlees there.
And I will be talking a lot about Dr. David Yellowlees.
Yeah. So I think we'll probably draw it to a close there. I hope you enjoyed this first podcast. Did you enjoy it, Louvain?
Yeah.
No, well, hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, or if you've got any comments or any ideas, then just put them into the comment section, and we'll be back again soon with another episode. See you soon, Louvain.
Bye.